Mothers by Sylvia Plath, 1962. Esther was still upstairs when Rose called in at the back door. Yoo-hoo, Esther, you ready? Rose lived with her retired husband Cecil in the topmost of the two cottages in the lane leading up to Esther's house, a large thatched manor farm with its own cobbled court. The cobbles were not ordinary street cobbles, but pitch cobbles, their narrow, oblong sides forming a mosaic melted to gentleness by centuries of boots and hooves. The cobbles extended under the stout, nail-studded oak door into the dark hall between the kitchen and scullery, and in old Lady Bromehead's day had formed the floor of the kitchen and scullery as well. But after old Lady Bromehead fell and broke her hip at the age of 90 and was removed to a home, a series of servantless tenants had persuaded her son to lay linoleum in those rooms. The oak door was the back door. Everybody but the random stranger used it. The front door, yellow painted and flanked by two pungent bushes of box, faced across an acre of stinging nettles to where the church indicated a gray heaven above its scallop of surrounding headstones. The front gate opened just under the corner of the graveyard. Esther tugged her red turban down around her ears, then adjusted the folds of her cashmere coat loosely so that she might, to the casual eye, seem simply tall, stately, and fat rather than 8 months pregnant. Rose had not rung the bell before calling in. Esther imagined Rose, curious, avid Rose, eyeing the bare floorboards of the front hall and the untidy strewing of the baby's toys from front room to kitchen. Esther couldn't get used to people opening the door and calling in without ringing first. The postman did it, and the baker, and the grocer's boy, and now Rose, who was a Londoner and should have known better. Once when Esther was arguing loudly and freely with Tom over breakfast, the back door had popped open and a handful of letters and magazines clapped onto the hall cobbles. The postman's cry of "morning" faded. Esther felt spied on. For some time after that, she bolted the back door from the inside. But the sound of tradesmen trying the door and finding it bolted in broad day and then ringing the bell and waiting until she came and noisily undid the bolt embarrassed her even more than their former calling in. So she left the bolt alone again and took care not to argue so much, or at least not so loudly. When Esther came down, Rose was waiting just outside the door, smartly dressed in a satiny lavender hat and checked tweed coat. At her side stood a blonde, bony-faced woman with bright blue eyelids and no eyebrows. This was Mrs. Nolan, the wife of the pub keeper at the White Hart. Mrs. Nolan, Rose said, never came to the Mothers' Union meetings because she had no one to go with. So Rose was bringing her to this month's meeting, together with Esther. "Do you mind waiting just another minute, Rose, while I tell Tom I'm off?" Esther could feel Rose's shrewd eyes checking over her hat, her gloves, her patent leather heels, as she turned and picked her gingerly way up the cobbles to the back garden. Tom was planting roller berries in the newly spaded square behind the empty stables. The baby sat in the path on a pile of red earth, ladling dirt into her lap with a battered spoon. Esther felt her little grievances about Tom's not shaving and his letting the baby play in the dirt fade at the sight of the two of them, quiet and in perfect accord. "Tom," she rested her white glove, without thinking, on the earth-crusted wooden gate. "I'm off now. If I'm late getting back, will you boil the baby an egg?" Tom straightened and shouted some word of encouragement that foundered between them in the dense November air, and the baby turned in the direction of Esther's voice, her mouth black as if she had been eating dirt. But Esther slipped away before the baby could heave up and toddle after her to where Rose and Mrs. Nolan were waiting at the bottom of the court. Esther let them through the 7-foot-high stockade-like gate and latched it behind them. Then Rose crooked out her two elbows, and Mrs. Nolan took one, and Esther took the other, and the three women teetered in their best shoes down the stony lane, past Rose's cottage and the cottage of the old blind man and his spinster sister at the bottom, and into the road. "We're meeting in the church today," Rose tongued a peppermint drop into her cheek and passed the twist of tinfoil round. Both Esther and Mrs. Nolan refused politely. "We don't always meet in church, though. Only when there's new members joining up." Mrs. Nolan rolled her pale eyes skyward, whether in general consternation or simply at the prospect of church, Esther couldn't tell. "Are you new in town, too?" she asked Mrs. Nolan across Rose's front, leaning forward a little. Mrs. Nolan gave a short, joyless laugh. "I've been here 6 years. Why, you must know everybody by now." Hardly a soul, Mrs. Nolan intoned, causing misgivings, like a flock of chili-toed birds, to clutter at Esther's heart. If Mrs. Nolan, an Englishwoman by her looks and accent, and a pubkeeper's wife as well, felt herself a stranger in Devon after 6 years, what hope had Esther, an American, of infiltrating that rooted society ever at all? The three women proceeded arm in arm along the road under the high, holly-hedged boundary of Esther's acre, past her front gate and on under the red cob wall of the churchyard, flat, lichen-bitten tombstones tilted at the level of their heads, worn deep into the earth long before pavements were thought of. The road curved like some ancient riverbed under its slanted banks. Along past the butcher's window with its midweek display of pork hocks and cartons of drippings, and up the alley by the constabulary and the public conveniences, Esther could see other women converging, singly and in groups, to the light gate. Burdened by their cumbersome woolens and drab hats, they seemed, without exception, gnarled and old. As Esther and Mrs. Nolan hung back at the gate, nudging Rose ahead, Esther recognized the uncommonly ugly person who had come up behind her, smiling and nodding as the woman who had sold her an immense rutabaga for 1 6 at the Harvest Festival. The Swede had bulged like a miraculous storybook vegetable above the rim of Esther's shopping basket, filling it entirely, but when she got round to slicing it up, it turned out to be spongy and tough as cork. 2 minutes in the pressure cooker, and it shrank to a wan, orange mash that blackened the bottom and sides of the pot with a slick, evil-smelling liquor. I should simply have boiled it straight off, Esther thought now, following Rose and Mrs. Nolan under the stumpy, pollarded limes to the church door. The interior of the church seemed curiously light. Then Esther realized she had never been inside before, except at night for evensong. Already the back pews were filling with women, rustling, ducking, kneeling, and beaming benevolently in every direction. Rose led Esther and Mrs. Nolan to an empty pew halfway up the aisle. She pushed Mrs. Nolan in first, then stepped in herself, drawing Esther after her. Rose was the only one of the three who knelt. Esther bowed her head and shut her eyes, but her mind remained blank. She just felt hypocritical. So she opened her eyes and looked about her. Mrs. Nolan was the one woman in the congregation without a hat. Esther caught her eye, and Mrs. Nolan raised her eyebrows, or rather the skin of her forehead where the brows had been. Then she leaned forward. "I never," she confided, "come here much." Esther shook her head and mouthed, "Neither do I." That was not quite true. A month after her arrival in town, Esther started attending evensong without a miss. The month's gap had been an uneasy one. Twice on Sundays, morning and evening, the town bell ringers sent their carillons pounding out over the surrounding countryside. There was no escape from the probing notes. They bit into the air and shook it with a doggy zeal. The bells made Esther feel left out, as if from some fine local feast. A few days after they had moved into the house, Tom called her downstairs for a visitor. The rector was sitting in the front parlor among the boxes of unpacked books. A small gray man with protruding ears, an Irish accent and a professionally benign, all-tolerating smile. He spoke of his years in Kenya, where he had known Jomo Kenyatta, of his children in Australia, and of his English wife. Any minute now, Esther thought, he's going to ask if we go to church, but the rector did not mention church. He dandled the baby on one knee and left shortly, his compact black figure dwindling down the path to the front gate. A month later, still perturbed by the evangelical bells, Esther dashed off, half in spite of herself, a note to the rector. She would like to attend evensong. Would he mind explaining the ritual to her? She waited nervously 1 day, 2 days each afternoon, readying tea and cake, which she and Tom ate only when the tea hour was safely past. Then on the third afternoon, she was basting a nightdress of yellow flannel for the baby when she happened to glance out of the window toward the front gate. A stout black shape paced slowly up through the stinging nettles. Esther welcomed the rector with some misgiving. She told him right away that she had been brought up a Unitarian, but the rector smilingly replied that as a Christian of whatever persuasion, she would be welcome in his church. Esther swallowed an impulse to blurt out that she was an atheist and end it there. Opening the book of common prayer the rector had brought for her use, she felt a sickly, deceitful glaze overtake her features. She followed him through the order of service. The apparition of the Holy Ghost and the words resurrection of the flesh gave her an itchy sense of her duplicity. Yet when she confessed that she really could not believe in the resurrection of the flesh, she did not quite dare to say, nor of the spirit, The rector seemed unperturbed. He merely asked if she believed in the efficacy of prayer. "Oh, yes, I do," Esther heard herself exclaim, amazed at the tears that so opportunely jumped to her eyes, and meaning only, "How I would like to." Later, she wondered if the tears weren't caused by her vision of the vast, irrevocable gap between her faithless state and the beatitude of belief. She hadn't the heart to tell the rector she had been through all this pious trying 10 years before in comparative religion classes at college, and only ended up sorry she was not a Jew. The rector suggested that his wife meet her at the next evensong service and sit with her so she should not feel strange. Then he seemed to think better of it. She might prefer, after all, to come with her neighbors Rose and Cecil. They were churchgoers. It was only as the rector picked up his 2 prayer books and his black hat that Esther remembered the plate of sugared cakes and the waiting tea tray in the kitchen. But by then it was too late. Something more than forgetfulness, she thought, watching the rector's measured retreat through the green nettles, had kept back those cakes. The church filled rapidly now. The rector's wife, long-faced, angular, kind, tiptoed back from her front pew to pass out copies of the Mother's Union service book. Esther felt the baby throb and kick and placidly thought, "I am a mother. I belong here." The primeval cold of the church floor was just beginning its deadly entry into her foot soles when, rustling and hushing, the women rose in a body and the rector, with his slow, holy gait, came down the aisle. The organ drew breath. They started on the opening hymn. The organist must have been a novice. Every few bars a discord prolonged itself, and the voices of the women skidded up and down. After the elusive melody and a scatty, cat-like desperation, there were kneelings, responses, more hymns. The rector stepped forward and repeated at length an anecdote which had formed the substance of his last evensong sermon. Then he brought out an awkward, even embarrassing metaphor Esther had heard him use at a baptism ceremony a week earlier about physical and spiritual abortions. Surely the rector was indulging himself. Rose slipped another peppermint between her lips, and Mrs. Nolan wore the gazed, far look of an unhappy seeress. At last, 3 women, 2 quite young and attractive, 1 very old, came forward and knelt at the altar to be received into the Mother's Union. The rector forgot the name of the eldest. Esther could feel him forgetting it, and had to wait until his wife had the presence to glide forward and whisper it in his ear. The ceremony proceeded. 4 o'clock had struck before the rector allowed the women to depart. Esther quitted the church in the company of Mrs. Nolan. Rose, having caught up with 2 of her other friends, Brenda, the wife of the greengrocer, and stylish Mrs. Hotchkiss, who lived on Windup Hill and bred Alsatians. "You staying for tea?" Mrs. Nolan asked, as the current of women ferried them across the street and down the alley toward the yellow brick constabulary. "That's what I came for," Esther said. "I think we deserve it. When's your next baby?" Esther laughed. "Any minute." The women were diverting themselves from the alley into a courtyard at the left. Esther and Mrs. Nolan followed them into a dark barn-like room which reminded Esther depressingly of church campouts and group sings. Her eyes searched the dusk for a tea urn or some other sign of conviviality, but fell on nothing but a shuttered upright piano. The rest of the women did not stop. They filed ahead up an ill-lit flight of steps. Beyond a pair of swinging doors, a brightly lit room opened out, revealing 2 very long tables set parallel to each other and swaddled with clean white linen. Down the center of the tables, plates of cake and pastries alternated with the bowls of brass-colored chrysanthemums. There was a startling number of cakes, all painstakingly decorated, some with cherries and nuts and some with sugar lace. Already the rector had taken a stand at the head of one table, and his wife at the head of the other, and the townswomen were crowding into the closely spaced chairs below. The women in Rose's group fitted themselves in at the far end of the rector's table. Mrs. Nolan was jockeyed unwillingly into a position facing the rector at the very foot, Esther at her right, and an empty chair that had been overlooked at her left. The women sat, settled. Mrs. Nolan turned to Esther. "What do you do here?" It was the question of a desperate woman. "Oh, I have the baby." Then Esther was ashamed of her evasion. "I type some of my husband's work." Rose leaned over to them. "Her husband writes for the radio." I paint, said Mrs. Nolan. What in? Esther wondered, a little startled. Oils mainly, but I'm no good. Ever tried watercolor? Oh, yes, but you have to be good. You have to get it right the first time. What do you paint then, portraits? Mrs. Nolan wrinkled her nose and took out a pack of cigarettes. Do you suppose we can smoke? No, I'm no good at portraits, but sometimes I paint Ricky. The tiny, extinguished-looking woman making the rounds with tea arrived at Rose. We can smoke, can't we? Mrs. Nolan asked Rose. Oh, I don't think so. I wanted to the worst way when I first came, but nobody else did. Mrs. Nolan looked up at the woman with the tea. Can we smoke? Oh, I shouldn't think so, the woman said. Not in the church rooms. Is it a fire law, Esther wanted to know, or something religious? But nobody could say. Mrs. Nolan began to tell Esther about her little boy of 7 named Benedict. Ricky was, it turned out, a hamster. Suddenly the swinging doors flew open to admit a flushed young woman with a steaming tray. The sausages, pleased voices cried from various parts of the room. Esther felt very hungry, almost faint. Even the ribbons of clear, hot grease oozing from her sausage and its pastry wrapper didn't stop her. She took a large bite, and so did Mrs. Nolan. At that moment, everybody bowed their heads. The rector said grace. Cheeks bulging, Esther and Mrs. Nolan peered at each other, making eyes and stifling their giggles like schoolgirls with a secret. Then, grace over, everybody began sending plates up and down and helping themselves with energy. Mrs. Nolan told Esther about little Benedict's father. Big Benedict, her second husband, who had been a rubber planter in Malaya until he had the misfortune to fall sick and be sent home. Have some dough bread. Rose passed a plate of moist, fruity slices, and Mrs. Hotchkiss followed this up with a 3-layer chocolate cake. Esther took a helping of everything. Who made all the cakes? The rector's wife, Rose said. She bakes a lot. The rector, Mrs. Hotchkiss inclined her partridge-wing hat, helps with the beating. Mrs. Nolan, deprived of cigarettes, drummed her fingers on the tabletop. I think I'll be going soon. I'll go with you, Esther spoke through a doughy mouthful. I've got to be back for the baby. But the woman was there again with refills of tea, and the 2 tables seemed more and more to resemble a large family gathering from which it would be rude to rise without offering thanks or at least seeking permission. Somehow the rector's wife had slipped from the head of her table and was bending maternally over them, one hand on Mrs. Nolan's shoulder, one on Esther's. This dough bread is delicious, said Esther, thinking to compliment her. Did you make it? Oh, no, Mr. Ockenden makes that. Mr. Ockenden was the town baker. There's a loaf over, though. If you like, you could buy it afterwards. Taken aback by this sudden financial pounce, Esther almost immediately recollected how church people of all orders were forever after pennies, offertories, and donations of one sort or another. She had found herself walking out from evensong recently with a blessings box, an austere wooden container with a slot into which one was apparently intended to drop money until the next year's harvest festival, when the boxes would be emptied and handed round again. I'd love a loaf, Esther said, a bit too brightly. After the rector's wife returned to her chair, there was a muttering and nudging among the middle-aged women in best blouses, cardigans, and round felt hats at the table's foot. Finally, on a spatter of local applause, one woman rose and made a little speech calling for a vote of thanks to the rector's wife for the fine tea. There was a humorous footnote about thanking the rector, too, for his help, evidently notorious in stirring the batter for the cakes. More applause, much laughter, after which the rector's wife made a return speech welcoming Esther and Mrs. Nolan by name. Carried away, she revealed her hopes of their becoming members of the Mothers' Union. In the general flurry of clapping and smiles and curious stares and a renewal of plate passing, the rector himself left his place and came to sit in the empty chair next to Mrs. Nolan. Nodding at Esther as if they had already had a great deal to say to each other, he began speaking in a low voice to Mrs. Nolan. Esther listened in unashamedly as she ate through her plate of buttered dough bread and assorted cakes. The rector made some odd jocular reference to never finding Mrs. Nolan in, at which her clear blonde skin turned a bright shade of pink, then said, I'm sorry, but the reason I've not called is because I thought you were a divorcee. I usually make it a point not to bother them. Oh, it doesn't matter now, does it? Muttered the blushing Mrs. Nolan, tugging furiously at the collar of her open coat. The rector finished with some little welcoming homily, which escaped Esther, so confused and outraged was she by Mrs. Nolan's predicament. I shouldn't have come, Mrs. Nolan whispered to Esther. Divorced women aren't supposed to come. That's ridiculous, Esther said. I'm going. Let's go now. Rose glanced up as her two charges started to button their coats. "I'll go with you. Cecil will want his tea." Esther glanced towards the rector's wife at the far end of the room, surrounded now by a group of chattering women. The extra loaf of dough bread was nowhere in sight, and she felt no desire to pursue it. She could ask Mr. Ockenden for a loaf on Saturday when he came round. Besides, she vaguely suspected the rector's wife might have charged her a bit over for it, to profit the church the way they did at jumble sales. Mrs. Nolan said goodbye to Rose and Esther at the town hall and started off down the hill to her husband's pub. The river road faded at its first dip in a bank of wet blue fog. She was lost to view in a few minutes. Rose and Esther walked home together. "I didn't know they didn't allow divorcees," Esther said. "Oh, no, they don't like them." Rose fumbled in her pocket and produced a packet of Maltesers. "Have one?" Mrs. Hotchkiss said that even if Mrs. Nolan wanted to join the Mothers' Union, she couldn't. "Do you want a dog?" "A what?" "A dog. Mrs. Hotchkiss has this Alsatian left over from the last lot. She sold all the black ones. Everybody loves those. And now there's just this gray one. Tom hates dogs." Esther surprised herself by her own passion, "especially Alsatians." Rose seemed pleased. "I told her I didn't think you'd want it. Dreadful things, dogs." The gravestones, greenly luminous in the thick dusk, looked as if their ancient lichens might possess some magical power of phosphorescence. The two women passed under the churchyard with its flat black yew, and as the chill of evening wore through their coats in the afterglow of tea, Rose crooked out one arm, and Esther, without hesitation, took it.